cannot do. But I keep trying, and then I fail, and then I have to fix. All right, move that to the other monitor. Make it big. Come back to the text of the Mishnah. And good. All right. I think that means everything is up and running. Good evening, everyone. Happy Erev Thanksgiving. There isn't such a thing, but why not? So we are looking at Keritot, and depending upon how we do, we might finish tonight. We might not finish tonight. It's sort of a roll of the die. But we are trying something a little different, or rather something a little older. Before we transitioned to the online version with COVID, we had been using the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism's translation from their Mishnah Yomit program for many, many years. When we transitioned online, it wasn't available, at least not in an easy format. And so we began using the Sefaria version, which has used the Davidson translation. However, it was requested that we give the USCJ translation another shot, that some people found it a little bit more systematic and organized, and I can certainly understand that. And thankfully, Sefaria includes it now. They don't go out of their way to draw attention to its origin, but that's okay. As long as the information is getting out there, that's what's most important. So we're going to do a little taste test, and we're going to try this translation for tonight. And as always, I welcome feedback on whether you find this an easier format, an easier translation to get your mind around. And if so, then we can stick with it. And if not, we can revert to the Davidson. It is still a translation of the same Mishnah. It may be slightly different English because, well, it's hard to translate the Mishnah into English and make it intelligible because English doesn't lend itself to the Mishnah's writing style. But we'll see how we do. Just a quick guide. When you're looking at the text on the page, you'll notice that it has been broken up. This is all Mishnah 7 from chapter 5, but this translation breaks it into sub-pieces, and this particular version of the translation takes the commentary and brings it immediately after the translation of the text itself. So anything in bold is a translation of the actual Mishnah. Anything not in bold is the commentator trying to help us understand more of what's going on. And I think you'll find that the tone is a little bit more conversational, which hopefully will help, but we'll see. And conveniently, Rabbi Kolb gives us an introduction to remind us of where we are. And in today's Mishnah, we find on the person's plate 2 pieces of forbidden fat, one consecrated, one unconsecrated. The plot thickens. So again, last week we were talking about a person who had 2 different pieces of fat on the plate under different circumstances. What type of offering would they need to bring, if any? So now we have 2 pieces. And as you'll see from our first section of Mishnah, if there was a piece of unconsecrated forbidden fat and a piece of consecrated forbidden fat, and a person ate one of them and does not know which, he is liable to a chatat. Now, Rabbi Akiva says also to an Asham talui. So what are we talking about here? Well, remember, the chelev, this forbidden fat, is forbidden whether it was forbidden from the cow that you slaughtered in your backyard to have for dinner, or whether it is a cow that has been slaughtered or that was meant for the altar, consecrated, that is. However, both eating forbidden fat of the normal variety and eating forbidden fat that comes from a consecrated animal, both of those are absolute sins, and both of them would have a chatat, the sin offering on their behalf. So even if you're not sure which one you ate, you are definitely liable to a chatat because both of them would have that as the punishment. Well, punishment's not the right word, but both of them would have them as the consequence and the means of rectifying the error. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, says that there also needs to be an Asham talui because there is still an element of doubt that you're not 100% sure which one you ate. yes, both of them are rectified by the chatat, but because of the doubt, it's still an issue. And as the commentary points out, we know that the person has eaten forbidden fat, so he definitely has to bring a chatat. According to the first opinion, that's all. According to Rabbi Akiva, he brings an Asham Talui for doubtful sacrilege, meaning for the possibly he has misused something that was consecrated, which
but
is
in addition or instead?
In addition. And then in part 3, paragraph 3 in this translation, if he then ate the second piece, he is liable to 2 chatats and 1 certain asham, right? So if he ate the second piece in a second period of unawareness, he is liable for 2 chatats, 1 for each piece of forbidden fat. He is also liable for the asham, the guilt offering for the sacrilege, meaning for the misappropriation of consecrated property. So each of the pieces of meat gets its own sin offering, the own chatat, because this is obviously assuming that he ate one, and then in a second period of unawareness, he ate the second. If he ate both of them straight through in one period of unawareness, we've already covered that before, he would only have to bring 1 sacrifice. But here, because they are 2 separate incidents, he brings 2 separate sacrifices. And since he definitely, by having finished the second piece, has absolutely for sure eaten one piece that was at least one piece that was consecrated, he also definitely has to bring the Asham for that use of forbidden food. And then part 4, if he ate one piece and then another, meaning another person came and ate the other, so now we have 2 people, each of them have definitely eaten something, and each of them have definitely eaten something that's wrong. Remember, one is the straight forbidden fat and the other is the consecrated forbidden fat. What happens? Each of them is liable to a chatat, just like our opinion back up in the first section. Rabbi Akiva says each of them brings, in addition, an Asham Talui, again, being consistent to his earlier position, that since there was still some doubt about maybe you also ate the sacrilegious, the sacred piece, that you also need to bring the Asham Talui. Rabbi Shimon holds, and this is going to sound familiar, each of them brings a chatat, and together they bring 1 Asham. Since together we know that between them, one of them definitely ate the piece that was consecrated, therefore they each participate in bringing the Asham, but do so with a stipulation. And Rabbi Yossi, as has been his position, 2 people cannot bring 1 Asham, right? So again, the commentator points out, both people are liable for a chatat for eating forbidden fat. According to Rabbi Akiva, they are both liable for an Asham Talui for doubtful sacrilege. Rabbi Shimon says that they can bring 1 certain Asham jointly, whereas Rabbi Yossi says this is not possible. This is the same debate we have seen over and over since Mishnah 4. All right, any questions on 5.8? Or sorry, 5.7? All right, 5.8 is going to be very similar. I promise chapter 6 is going to introduce a lot of new ideas. So if you can't wait for us to get rid of the fat, just hold on. We're only 1 Mishnah away. So 5.8. The final Mishnah of our chapter deals with the case where one of the pieces of meat was regular forbidden fat and the other was forbidden fat and notar. Now, notar we've encountered before, and I'm sure in our studies we will encounter again, so it's good to commit it to memory. This is a remnant. This is a leftover piece of a sacrifice that is no longer permitted to be eaten or used. So, if there was a piece of forbidden fat and another piece of forbidden fat, which at the same time was notar, and a person ate one of them and does not know which, he is liable to a chatat and to an Asham Talui. Why? Well, the commentator explains, if he eats one of the pieces, he certainly must bring 1 chatat for eating chelev, the forbidden fat. He must also bring an Asham Talui, lest he ate the piece that is also notar. So the notar also requires the Asham Talui because there is doubt of whether he ate that one or not. And since it is already past the time when it could be eaten or used correctly, then it is something which triggers this doubtful need, this need for a sacrifice because of the doubt. And then part 2, or part 3, I guess, if we're going to go by the numbers on the side, although it's funny counting the introduction as part 1. If he then ate the second piece, he is liable to 3 chatats. Right? This is how do you maximize the number of sacrifices you have to bring. 2 chatats are for the forbidden fat, piece 1 and piece 2, assuming that they were eaten in 2 periods of unawareness. And the third chatat is for eating notar. That should hopefully make a little bit of sense. And then number 4 is going to look really, really familiar. If he ate 1 piece and then another, meaning another person came and ate the other, each of them brings a chatat and an asham talui. Rabbi Shimon says each of them brings a chatat, and together they bring another chatat, that third chatat mentioned in part 3. Rabbi Yossi says any chatat that is brought for the expiation of sin cannot be offered by 2 people. They both must bring 1 chatat, for they both certainly ate chalev. They ate the forbidden fat. According to the first opinion, they both bring an asham talui, for each of them might have also eaten, well, actually, that should be a mistake there. For each of them might have also eaten notar. That should be read. Rabbi Shimon holds that they can jointly bring a second chatat, and Rabbi Yossi again holds that 2 people can never jointly bring a sacrifice that comes to expiate for sin. Fairly straightforward if you've been playing along for chapter 5. All right. Chapter 6 begins with what we probably would have liked to have known way back in chapter 1. What happens if you find out that you actually didn't do anything wrong? Right? What happens if you're cleared of the sin for which you were bringing this asham talui? Right? Remember, as the introduction says, an asham talui is brought when a person is not sure if he has sinned. Our Mishnah, meaning chapter 6, Mishnah 1, discussed what happens if after he brought it, he finds out that he did not sin. That is to say, he ate the right piece of meat in the previous examples in chapter 5, where there were perfectly fine pieces of meat and others that weren't. Or perhaps he had sex with his wife and not his sister. And once he is sure of that, what is the result with regards to the sacrificial service? Obviously, the result in category number 2 is he is greatly relieved. But what happens with the sacrifice? If a person,
disappointed and upset.
Let's err on the side of kaf zachut, on the side of merit, and assume that he would be relieved. If a person brought an asham talui, meaning they have brought it to the temple, and then found out that he did not sin. If it was before the animal was slaughtered, it may go out to pasture among the flocks. The words of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is saying that if you have designated this goat is going to be my offering because of the asham talui circumstance, whatever it might be, and you've designated it, and then it turns out that you didn't do anything, then no harm, no foul. The goat can go back to the flock. It returns to being a regular old run-of-the-mill goat. Now, that's very different than other cases where if you designate an animal for a sacrifice, you can't just take it back out to the flock. There's a process for redemption, and in many cases, redemption of the animal is impossible at all. But Rabbi Meir is saying, no, look, you brought it because you thought you had made, there was potential that you might have had a sin, but now that we know you didn't, your designation doesn't count because you didn't commit a sin. The sages, and they do win this argument, the sages say it goes out to pasture until it becomes blemished, and it is then sold, and the money goes for free will offerings. So the sages' position is that that animal, when you designated it, was legitimately designated because of the doubt that you had at that moment. And even though the doubt has been removed later, it does not retroactively undo the designation that you made. However, because the doubt has been removed, the animal cannot be brought to be slaughtered because it no longer is necessary as an Asham Talui. Therefore, you're in this middle zone. You can't take the animal back because it's consecrated, and you can't take the animal to the altar because the need is no longer there. So what you do is you take it back out and you let it just do its own animal thing. You don't use it, you don't work it, you don't get its wool or whatever. And eventually, in the course of time, the animal will somehow become blemished, through one means or another. And at that point, it's no longer fit to be on the altar. And that means you can sell it, but the value of the animal is still consecrated and thus goes to the temple and can be used for free will offerings whenever necessary. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, is the reason you can't undesignate it, is that because when you designate it, it becomes holy and then you can't unmake it holy?
Well, that's what the sages are saying. Now, Rabbi Meir is saying that you can because your designation was in error. That right. Because you were designating it thinking that you might have committed a sin, and now that we know you definitely didn't, then your designation was just a mistake. And that's perfectly fine to undo a mistaken designation. And the sages are saying, no, it's not a mistaken designation because at the moment you truly were in doubt, and therefore your designation sticks. However, because it hasn't been slaughtered yet, now that the doubt has been removed, we can't go forward with the sacrifice. And so we need to have this other way to turn it into value that can be given to the temple without going on the altar directly.
And Rabbi,
yes.
When it talks about the I take it you wait for it to become blemished so it becomes disqualified.
Right.
How do they distinguish between when you can redeem something that's disqualified versus when you have to burn it?
So we're going to get some burning, and I believe the very next section. So we'll cover that in just a minute. Now, Rabbi Eliezer says it shall be offered up, for it does not expiate. If it does not expiate this sin, it will expiate another sin. So Rabbi Eliezer, in a fashion that we have seen him advocate in the past, is saying, look, this is all about trying to cover a doubtful sin. And if it doesn't cover this sin, well, there's probably something else you've done wrong. And we'll just say that it covers that sin. Since you've already got it here and it's already ready to go, well, we'll assume it covers something else, right? Therefore, it can still be used.
Who won the sages?
The sages are the winners of this argument. Yes.
And Rabbi,
Aaron, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Aaron.
That's the same thing. Joel tried to do that, right? Job tried to do that.
Yes, exactly right.
All
right. We talked about this in the previous chapter of the idea of, well, there's probably something that's been going on. So I'm sure that it must have been like that. Now, I'm not going to read through the whole translation, whole commentary, because it's very much what we just said, and it gets a little long if I read every word out loud. But I'll leave it up here for review if people want to pause and read through it. Now, part 3 moves the clock forward, right? The part 2 was we found out that there was no sin before it was slaughtered. Part 3, if he learns of it after it was slaughtered, the blood shall be spilled out and the flesh is removed to the place of burning. So here the animal has actually been killed, but the blood has not been sprinkled on the altar. So therefore, what do we do? And the answer is, well, you can't make the animal alive again. That doesn't work. However, you cannot take the blood to the altar or do anything else with the sacrifice because, well, it's no longer a valid sacrifice. There's no longer the need because there is no longer doubt. And therefore, it is burnt. And that there was a special place for all of the sacrifices that were invalid, that had already been slaughtered and could not be redeemed in any other way. And that was where they would burn them because there was nothing else to be done with the body of an animal that could have gone to the altar, but has now become inappropriate for the altar. And so all that we can do is just burn it. Now, this burning is not on the altar. This burning is in a separate place that was set aside for destroying things that have been sanctified, but which were no longer fit for the altar itself. And with no, to answer your question from the last section, Aaron, and with no other means of redeeming it. We can't redeem the body of the animal. All right, and then part 4 of this Mishnah.
But Rabbi.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I know we like adjudicate on the specifics, but can they differentiate why this one gets burned and the other one, when it's disqualified, even though it remains its designation as holy, doesn't get burned?
Well, because it's still alive, and thus there's another avenue for redeeming it. They weren't going to advocate just burning up the animal that was not fit to be offered. So, there would have been a bit of an issue if you take a consecrated animal that cannot be actually taken to the altar. Slaughtering it would be a misappropriation of a consecrated animal, because the slaughter would be nowhere for it to go. You can't take the body to the altar. So you can't just kill a consecrated animal that is no longer fit for the altar, or no longer matching to a sin for the altar. Instead, you have to let it become blemished and then redeem it through money, and then use the money for a free will offering. Here, here the animal is already dead, and so there's no other alternative of what do we do with this this partially sanctified act. We can't just throw it away, because it did reach to the altar, and that would give the entire wrong opinion an impression of what to do with a sanctified but now inappropriate act or animal. So all that's left is to deal with it like we would with any other no longer fit offering or sacrifice, and that is to burn it completely, but not on the altar. And go ahead.
I was gonna say, but you can't redeem it, I guess, because it's touched the altar. Is that the problem?
Because it's already dead. Exactly. Because it's already dead. There's no redemption of a dead animal.
All right.
All right. And then verse 4, we're going to move the timeline ahead even more. If the blood had already been tossed, meaning onto the altar, the flesh may be eaten. Right? Rabbi Yossi says, even if the blood is still in the vessel, it should be tossed in the flesh, then eaten. And I'll read the commentary since I think he explains it succinctly. Once the blood has been tossed onto the altar, the sacrifice is valid, even if it turns out that he didn't sin, meaning that at the moment the blood touches the altar, the sacrifice is concluded. You have done the sacrifice. And even if it turns out later that the sacrifice was done in error, because he finds out that he didn't eat the wrong piece or whatever, the sacrifice at the moment that it actually reached its completion, which was the blood hitting the altar, was valid. Therefore, the flesh can be eaten. Rabbi Yossi pushes the clock back a little bit and holds that once the blood is in the vessel, where it is put immediately after the animal is slaughtered, the sacrificial process can continue, even if it turns out the person didn't sin. Essentially, Rabbi Yossi is saying that the collection of the blood is the moment that the sacrifice has been fulfilled, not the moment the blood hits the altar. So he has a few minutes earlier in his window of the sacrifice has been formally completed, meaning like locked in as valid, as opposed to the sages.
And Rabbi, they're talking about a certain Asham or a Hatat, right?
Well, this one is all about Asham Talui, about the doubtful, the sin that with the English, the sacrifice that was brought in case the person had committed a transgression. Like, I ate from one of the pieces of meat, one of them was okay, it turns out the other one wasn't, but I don't know which one. I'll bring an Asham Talui, but in the process of bringing it, somebody comes running up going, wait, it's okay, you didn't eat the wrong one. Then, depending upon when that messenger arrives, the different parts of Mishnah 1 kick in.
But I thought you couldn't eat the Asham Talui anyways. Like, after you sacrifice, I thought
you couldn't, but the Kohanim can.
Oh. So this benefits the Kohanim if
If I mean, I guess we can look at it of who benefits when. But first of all, it's always important to remember the rabbis were not pro Kohanim, meaning they were not always looking to give the Kohanim more. They were trying to be as clear from the Torah text as they could be. And secondly, it's only pro if it actually happens in that extra few minutes. It's not like this is a major revolutionary change where Rabbi Yossi is saying, eat everything, and the sages are saying, eat nothing. It's just if the blood is in the bowl but not on the altar, that's the only window of difference that the two sides have in part 4. It's something that we can argue about, but I wouldn't exactly ascribe any motive of benefit to that decision. All right. Now, that was the Asham Talui. Today I'm reading his introduction, right, which was originally you would receive, and you can still sign up for this, but you would receive 1 Mishnah per day from United Synagogue. And so it was often written as a day-by-day thing. So yesterday's Mishnah dealt with the person who set aside an Asham Talui, that Asham because of a doubtful issue, and found out he didn't sin. Today's Mishnah deals with other situations in which a person sets aside an animal and then finds out the circumstances that caused him to set it aside the animal were not as he thought they were. All right, so we're going to get some examples as we go, but the idea here is that this is not for an Asham Talui, this is for a regular Asham. You think that you committed a sin, and therefore you brought the Asham. And as the Mishnah says, the law is different with a certain Asham. If before the animal was slaughtered, it may go out to pasture among the flocks. Now, let me finish. That's the way it's written. Let's finish it, and then we'll analyze it. If after it was slaughtered, it shall be buried. If after the blood was tossed, the flesh must be removed to the place of burning. All right, so the issue here that's different from our issue in part 1 is that here, when is the actual consecration happening? When the actual consecration is happening, it turns out you were wrong. You were mistaken. And that means that indeed your consecration of the animal was wrong. And that mistaken consecration can be undone. It can be canceled. So if I thought I needed to bring an Asham, not maybe I need to bring a Asham, I thought I did. Then if I find out before the animal's been slaughtered that I don't, then my designation of the animal is considered to be retroactively nullified because it was just a mistake all along. Remember, in part 1, that is to say in Mishnah 1, it was still considered to be a valid designation because it was designating the doubt, and the doubt was legitimate. Here, I didn't have any doubt. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I was mistaken. And because of that mistake, it is now undone. Now, it may sound a little weird that it is more lenient in the case of a definite Asham as opposed to the suspended Asham because of the Asham Talui because of doubt, but that is the way the logic works out. The doubt was real, and so when you designated it, it was legit. Here, the inspiration for designating it turns out to have been an error, therefore your designation has nothing to stand on. And as such, the other rules fall into place as well. If it has been slaughtered, you bury it, right? Because it's just an animal. And yes, it's been killed, and so you just bury it. You don't have to do anything special. If the blood has been tossed, well, now it has been brought to the altar, at least the blood as was designated. And therefore, even though it technically wasn't an official sacrifice, and we can't undo the blood sprinkling, but we can get rid of the rest. Now, there was some discussion of whether actually it would need to be burnt or not, but in general, they said that in order for the sake of appearance, we wanted to make sure that it would be burnt because that was the way we normally handled disqualified sacrifices. And this was to keep it consistent. All right, any questions? All right, part 3 of Mishnah 2. The law is also different regarding an ox to be stoned. You may remember, if you've read through the Torah recently, well, not recently, the past few weeks, but maybe in the last year, that there are certain types of oxes that have to be stoned, the kind that murder people. If before it was stoned, it may go out to pasture among the flock. If it turns out that that's not the cow you thought it was, right? You've got the wrong ox, then you take it and you let it go. If after it was stoned, it is permitted for use, right? Yes, you're right. It was the wrong ox. We killed it by mistake. Okay, well, we can use the body. Now, we can't use the body to eat because we killed the ox through stoning, and stoning is not proper slaughter, not shtita, which we'll study more when we get to Chulin. But we could use the meat or the leather or any other part of the animal that was for a appropriate use other than eating, because it is not necessary to set it aside as we would for an ox that was actually being stoned because it had actually murdered someone else. Does everyone get that distinction? Right? If it was the wrong ox, then you treat it like a dead ox. If it was the right ox, then we wouldn't be allowed to do that. And even though we stoned it, which might make it seem like it's been now designated, the only reason it was stoned was based off an error. Therefore, it reverts retroactively to its normal status of just being an ox.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Stoning doesn't count as a designation, though, does it? Because that's just a punishment, so it doesn't become holy when it's designated, right?
Right, and that's exactly what this Mishnah is trying to draw our attention to, is that you might think, and we're going to get more of that in part 4, you might think that because it was, I'm trying to think of a different word than designated, because it was singled out as being worthy of being stoned, that because you had made that proclamation over it, that it had somehow taken on the status of an ox that needs to be stoned. But because it was based upon the error, once the error was revealed, you can treat the ox, whether it's alive or if it's unfortunately a little too late, the governor's reprieve came in too late, whatever state it's in, you can use it as a regular ox, that its status never officially changed, or rather it changed twice, being designated and then undesignated retroactively to the way that it actually is allowed to be used. Because even though it isn't designated in holiness, it isn't consecrated, if the ox legitimately did need to be stoned, then it would take on a special status that would prevent us from using its body. And that's what they're trying to clarify here. And then part 4 is going to deal with a similar situation, but this time with the broken neck heifer. Just a quick reminder that this is one of the mitzvot in the Torah, where if you come across a body that is in the middle of nowhere, and there is no murderer that is caught for the crime, that you measure to the nearest town, and that town has to bring out a heifer that has never been used, and then its neck is broken as the people of the town say, we did not do this. We were not involved, which is a very interesting and moving ceremony, which we've talked about at other times. But here's the question. What happens if you find the murderer before you do the ceremony or during the ceremony? So, part 4. The law is also different regarding the heifer whose neck is to be broken. If its neck was broken, if before its neck was broken, meaning someone runs up and says, we caught the real murderer, it may go out to pasture among the flock, right? It goes back to being a regular cow and probably feels very lucky. If after its neck was broken, it shall be buried on the spot, for it was from the outset brought in a matter of doubt. It has atoned for the doubt, and so it has served its purpose. So making explicit what I've been trying to say implicitly throughout the section is when the cow was brought up and when its neck was broken, you completed the ceremony that was set in motion by the doubt over the identity of the murderer. Once its neck's been broken, even if you haven't finished the ritual with the burial, you can go ahead and finish the ritual with the burial, because at the moment that it was effected, at the moment that the ceremony was reaching its climax, its peak, the breaking of the neck, it was still doing its job of answering the doubt of the situation. And therefore, we carry on as though there was no new information. And then once that's done, we go and take care of the murder trial. And that was something we covered when we covered murder in a previous section, where you don't get off from murder just because the neck already got broken on a cow. The cow died for the doubt, but it doesn't die to clear you of your guilt. You still have to go stand trial. Yes, Aaron.
So just if I get this right, this seems like it's kind of almost like a sin offering, and that's why it atones for sins. So does it take on some kind of holiness, or?
Well, it doesn't exactly take on holiness in the way that an offering to the temple takes on holiness.
Right.
It's not sanctified in that way. But like the cow who gored, it becomes of restricted use. And that restricted use is something that is of consequence of what can you do with the cow at different times.
But I thought the cow, basically, if you found out that it didn't actually kill the person, because it seems like the stoning almost looks like punishment. If you found out it didn't kill the person, it reverts back to a non-criminal cow.
It does. And same here. If you catch the murderer, then this heifer goes back to being a regular cow rather than being part of this ritual.
Oh, but I thought if you catch the murderer after the neck was broken, then it doesn't. And I was wondering if that's because it has already atoned for whatever it's meant to atone for.
Well, as it says, it's not a question of atoning per se. It is brought in response to the doubt of the identity of the murderer.
So,
right, it doesn't per se atone for the actual murder, because that will be up to the actual trial and up to God, if no trial can happen, to reconcile with the person who is the murderer. What it's actually doing, and if we study this in more detail, we would look at more information on this, is it is trying to clear the town that it did not contribute to the circumstances which led to this murder. The most famous, and actually one that is very appropriate for where we are in the Torah reading, is the idea that the town may not have properly escorted, properly protected travelers, the same way that we see Jacob escorting Joseph as he goes out on his trip. So perhaps they did not escort, and therefore the town wasn't guilty of murder, but they were guilty of negligence. That within their district, within their precinct, they did not properly prevent the circumstances that led to this tragedy. But that's different than just calling it a straight sin offering.
But Rabbi, how would catching the person atone for the negligence? If you're negligent, whether or not you caught the person, right?
Yes and no, because they did their job of at least catching the murderer. Right? They have ensured that there is at least that level of justice that is carried out by actually making sure the murderer is brought to trial. All right, 6.3. So this gets into our Job situation. A reminder, if you haven't read the book of Job recently, Job used to bring sacrifices all the time, every day, as a precautionary measure. Maybe he or maybe his kids did something wrong. Well, in Mishnah 3 here, we're going to see that idea in more detail, under the microscope. Rabbi Eliezer says, one may freely offer an Asham talui every day and at any time he pleases. And such a sacrifice is called the Asham of the pious. All right, so as I mentioned, Rabbi Eliezer holds that one can freely offer an Asham talui whenever he wants, even if he doesn't know that he has sinned. This differs from the rules concerning a chatat. A chatat, the actual sin offering, can only be brought by one who knows that he has sinned, which we talked about before, because a chatat must affect atonement. You need an actual sin for the sin offering to cause atonement. That's the formula. In contrast, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Asham Talui does not really affect atonement, because when the person finds out that he actually sinned, he must bring a chatat anyway. This is evidence that the Asham Talui is really, in Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, just a free will offering. Note that this matches his opinion in Mishnah 1 that we've talked about before. This Asham is called the Asham of the Pious, the Chassid, because one brings it just in case he sins. And with that in mind, we then see a particular person who was doing this type of thing. They said of Bava ben Buti that he used to freely offer an Asham Talui every day, except on the day after Yom Kippur. He declared, by this temple, it's a form of an oath, had they allowed me, meaning had the sages allowed me, I would have offered one even then, the day after Yom Kippur. But they said to me, wait until you have come to a state of doubt. All right, so the Mishnah relates the story of Bava ben Buti, who would bring an Asham every day because he was so pious, and as it mentions, he must have also been quite rich, except for the day after Yom Kippur. Since Yom Kippur atones for all sins, and certainly for ones which a person doesn't even know if he committed, he didn't need to bring it on that one day. But he goes on to say that he wanted to bring an Asham Talui that day as well. The other sages seem to have convinced him that he shouldn't do so until there is at least a chance that he sinned. It is possible that the other sages worried that if he would bring an Asham Talui on the day after Yom Kippur, people would think that Yom Kippur doesn't atone. Therefore, they opposed his doing so, which I find to be a brilliant insight into human nature, that if people saw this Bava bringing a sacrifice just in case he sinned, right after Yom Kippur, people would say, well, maybe Yom Kippur doesn't actually clear us of our sins. And as soon as you believe that there is no way to clear ourselves of sin, Yom Kippur being the most important, then everything begins to fall apart. Because now we believe that we are burdened with an unending litany and debt of sin that cannot be cleansed, and that we are in perpetual problem. And eventually that becomes an idea that leads to Christianity. But Judaism says, no, Yom Kippur works, and we need to make sure that people know Yom Kippur works. So keep your Asham Talui home that day. Now, we're going to see that the sages disagree with this whole idea of bringing one all the time. But I see your hand up, Natan. So what's your question?
Oh, yes. If I remember correctly, we didn't say that the Hazar was against the Asham Talui, that if you don't know exactly what is your failure, what you did incorrectly, don't bring anything. Because that's what I understood from the past, but I see that they continue bringing the issue of Asham Talui.
Not exactly. They are against bringing a sacrifice if you don't know the sin, if you have no idea that you sinned. But for the situations where you have committed a transgression, that if you did it on purpose, you would have karet. That's why the whole section is called Keritot. Then in that situation where you know it's possible that you did it, there were two pieces of meat, you know you ate one of them, it might have been the wrong one. You know you slept with someone, it might have been the wrong person. As long as there is grounds for believing that you might have done something which, had you done it on purpose, would have been karet as the punishment, they allowed an Asham Talui, but only for that category. So they are trying to limit it to that narrow confines. However, in Mishnah 3 here, we are saying, okay, but what about somebody who thinks they might have done something? They don't actually know that they slept with someone that might have been their sister. They don't actually know they ate some meat that might have been the forbidden fat, but they might have done it and not known that they might have done it. So could they bring in a Asham Talui just in case, sort of a double layer of protection? And that was what Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, no problem. And then they have an example of a guy that likes to do that. And then in part 4, we're going to see the sages go, no, stop it. That's not what this is for. So let's get number 4 on the board, and then we can talk about it a bit. Just a second, Aaron. Before we get to your answer, let me just get the part 4 of Mishnah 3, and then we'll try and summarize the whole topic. But the sages say one may not bring an Asham Talui except for a sin that is, as I just mentioned, punished by karet when done intentionally, for which one brings a chatat when done unwittingly. Right? The sages reject Rabbi Eliezer. They hold that one can bring an Asham Talui only if he thinks he might have committed a sin for which he would be liable for karet if done intentionally or chatat if done unwittingly. He cannot simply freely donate an Asham Talui out of piety. Now, he can absolutely bring a free will offering whenever he feels like it. And that is perfectly fine. If a person wants to sacrifice every sheep they own and bring them to the temple every day, they are allowed to do that as a free will offering as much as they and their pocketbook can support. But to call it a sin offering or even a suspended guilt offering is simply inappropriate. Because without the knowledge of the sin, without the knowledge of at least the possibility of these karet type sins, then you are misusing and misrepresenting the sacrificial service. That is not what confession is meant to be. That is not what atonement means in Judaism. It is about recognizing a specific error, or at least in this particular case, a specific potential for a specific error, and then bringing an offering in case you, in that doubtful case, you committed that particular category of error because they are so serious, or in all other cases, only when you are sure that you actually made the mistake. Aaron?
Hey, Rabbi, what is the purpose of a free will offering? I know you could make it at any time, but why would you do that instead of giving it to like as a charity or something?
Because there is a different emotional and spiritual response from doing a free will offering as opposed to giving it to tzedakah or just eating the sheep as dinner. The free will offering was meant to be a way of showing gratitude and joy in being together with God in an act that was always very special. I know we take meat for granted, but the eating of a free will offering, and especially sharing it with others, including the poor, would give a chance to celebrate God in your life and to feel God's presence during that feasting. And so it was a different emotion than just saying, you know what, my neighbor needs extra meat, here, have a sheep, or I'm hungry, let's have a sheep. All three were perfectly valid opportunities for eating sheep. And each was appropriate for different times. You didn't have to always go to the temple. You didn't have to only give your sheep to tzedakah. And sometimes you were allowed to just have a sheep, to just have some lamb. That was also okay.
But was that supposed to be like an act of pious so people could, would people do something like that to show off their piety? Or, because I remember that was a problem at 1.2 with the Pharisees.
So I wouldn't say it was a chance to show off. I mean, obviously, anytime you have any physical activity, there is always the potential that someone's going to turn it into a gratuitous display. That's human nature, right? I need to drive to work. Someone is going to go buy the fanciest car they can find to drive to work, and they're going to make the most noise while driving it so everyone looks at their fancy car. That doesn't mean that cars are about showing off. It just means that, yes, sometimes it's hard to prevent that. So if somebody really, really, really wanted to go around bragging about how super pious they were by constantly inviting people to come join them when they had the free will offering at the temple, yes, they could do that, and it would absolutely be obnoxious and a bad character trait. Better than showing off in worse ways, but still not the appropriate kavanah, the appropriate spirit. But if a person just really was moved because there was a happy event in their life, or they were feeling just especially blessed that time to bring this free will offering, we shouldn't judge them for that. They're just happy. And we see this continue to this day when people make a donation to the synagogue, for example. Sometimes it's in honor of a loved one or in honor of a memory of a loved one. Sometimes it is to mark a particularly joyous milestone. Sometimes it's just because they are happy and grateful, and they want to share that with the community.
Yeah, I just remember around this time frame, didn't we talk about the Pharisees trying to be over pious?
Oh, I mean, the rabbis are absolutely unhappy with people that try to show off their piety. That is absolutely something the rabbis were concerned with and definitely criticized. But if they're not breaking the law, you can't stop them from doing it. So they're not saying don't bring an Asham Talui because you look over pious. They're saying don't bring an Asham Talui for everything, because that's not what this sacrifice is supposed to be. And that really is one of the problems of people who are trying to be overly pious, is oftentimes in their attempt to be super pious, they actually break the real rules. And just because you think you're showing off by how wonderfully holy you are, if you are trampling the actual rules, well, that's a big problem. And the classic example of that is with Shaul, with King Saul, when he was supposed to wipe out all of the animals of the Amalekites, and instead allows some of them to be kept, presumably for a sacrifice. And the prophet Samuel says, which do you think God prefers? More sacrifices, or you doing what God asked you to do? And the obvious answer is God wants you to do what God asked, not just throw more sacrifices down in front of God. So yes, the rabbis were very much on guard against excessive piety, especially when it began to trample the actual law. Natan?
Rabbi.
Oh, sorry, I saw Natan's hand.
And the voluntary offering is only meat, or could be any kind. For example, if I'm a poor person, can be just one pita, can
So
be
I have-
an orange.
So I have to go back and double check whether this is also part of the scaling system. I believe so, that there are ways to bring free will offerings that are not always from the top of the food chain. But that I have to double check, because I haven't studied that section recently.
And Rabbi.
And you can invite as many people as you want.
Well, as many people as can enjoy the meat.
No, I mean that the idea is very similar to the Pesach, that you can invite as many people if you want to celebrate for your promotion and job. So you want to do a voluntary offering, thanking God for the opportunity. So you can invite as kind of the Pesach. As many
Yes and no. Because for Pesach in particular, it's not an invitation. In Pesach, you have multiple participants that are all part of the lamb. They all purchased the lamb, even if they only purchased a tiny piece, because it has to be their lamb when the sacrifice gets made. So Pesach is not the perfect example,
No.
but if it was a different holiday like Sukkot or Shavuot, where you might be offering more than your neighbor was offering, then, or some people couldn't afford an offering at all, then you would share it with as many people as you could. Yes.
Hey, Rabbi.
Yes.
Is there a reason they didn't use Job as an example? Because the way you read Job, it makes it look like God was happy that he was making all these offerings. So this could have clarified it, right?
So it could have, but Job is I don't want to say exactly controversial, but he is kind of a controversial person within the rabbinic literature. On the one hand, Job is held up as somebody that is very strong in his faith in God and very devoted to God, and somebody who withstands a great deal of suffering. But on the other hand, his model of life is not exactly held up as the example of what we should all do. Indeed, there are many within the rabbinic commentary that says that Job actually did sin. That, as much as we criticize the friends of Job, saying that bad things only happen to people who sin, Job did actually commit sins, right? His behavior was in error. And there are many different reasons why they trot that out. And so therefore, maybe he didn't deserve everything that happened to him. And we should never think that anybody suffering deserves everything happening to them. But maybe he wasn't also entirely blameless. And maybe the conversation that God has with the adversary is precisely to help us sharpen our understanding of people in the world, and to look upon them with more mercy and compassion. as well as to have more gratitude for what we have. Something that I think blends in very nicely with our holiday of Thanksgiving.
Right. Just the way I read it, at least while he was rich, it seems like he was a good rich person. I should say good, rich, healthy person.
And he was, and remember, he was, the book of Job is something else that we should always set aside as another time to study, because, he is a fascinating look at human behavior. When he was wealthy, he was with God. When he was poor, he was with God. When he was sick is where it drew the line. When he got sick, he complained. And he said, you know what, God, this isn't fair. And as much as in English, the term, the patience of Job has become the vernacular for somebody that puts up with anything, Job did not put up with everything. He put up with a lot. And eventually he said, you know what, God, no, this doesn't work. I don't deserve this, which, of course, is the exact point of the book, is that we should not think that everybody who suffered deserves it. We should recognize that someone like Job didn't deserve everything that happened to him. And thus, God was still on his side, and God still loved him a lot more than the fake pious friends that showed up and kept blaming him for his own circumstance.
And don't we see the same kind of behavior during the Holocaust when people were in the concentration camps and stuff?
During the Holocaust, it's a mixed record of what people thought, and everybody going through that tragedy would have to navigate it on their own. More shockingly and disappointingly, in my opinion, the people after the Holocaust who have tried to say that somehow the people in the Shoah deserved it is just shocking. And unfortunately, that has happened even within our own community, let alone among the anti-Semites of the world. But no, we are told time and time again by not only Torah, but also rabbinic literature, we never say that everything that happens to a person is because of their own mistakes.
Right.
That unfortunately, other people mess up in choosing to cause evil to someone else. And that is also part of the world.
I just thought there were statements where people would curse God in the Holocaust a lot from the historical accounts that I heard.
Of course. There are some that would keep every mitzvah they could. Famous examples of people smuggling Torahs into the camps or having, putting together little bits of oil to light for Hanukkah in keeping with our season this time of year. And there were other people that threw away their Judaism both during or right after they were liberated from the camps because they could not reconcile the suffering with their belief in God. And like I said, I would never judge anybody who went through those horrors. I can't even begin to imagine what they went through. And it is, a tragedy of unimaginable scale. All right, we didn't quite finish, but I am confident we will finish next week. So we'll pick up at 6:4 next week. And I'm sure that we'll make it to the end because the last half of this chapter is not too hard. But it does have some very interesting ideas, and you got to stay tuned. As always, the last Mishnah in every Masechet is always one that is very interesting. And Mishnah Keritot, Masechet Keritot does not disappoint.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone, and have a great Thanksgiving.